Hello, New Press Book. Welcome to RTB 2021 for November the 12th, 2021. Hope you're doing well today. So we got some great text for today. We've got 2 Kings 25, ending the book of 2 Kings on a pretty, well, there's some positive and negative in this. It's obviously very negative, but we'll end with a spark of hope at the very end. And then we'll have, Hebrews 7, Amos chapter 1, starting the book of Amos, a great book, and then finally Psalm 144. So I'm going to start with the book of Hebrews today. So Hebrews is a book we've talked about before earlier in the year, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, but here's the text, of course, that famously speaks of Melchizedek. Now, remember who Melchizedek was, going all the way back to Genesis 14, where in just several verses there in Genesis 14, he's introduced as this individual who is on his ally of Abraham as Abraham goes out and tries to rescue Lot, who had been taken captive by several of these leaders of city-states in that region. And so as after Abraham's victory, he comes back and Melchizedek gives him this offering, and Melchizedek comes out to greet him, to give him his congratulations, and Abraham ends up giving Melchizedek a tithe of the spoils of the war, and then Melchizedek just disappears until Psalm 110, which we talked about before, where he appears once again as in a text that will be quoted here in this text of Hebrews 7, and then he won't appear again until the book of Hebrews. So what's so significant about this king of Salem, this Melchizedek? Well, as I mentioned, the main significance of Melchizedek is in his identification, who he is, and how he sets a pattern for ultimately what would be the messianic role of Jesus himself. So Melchizedek is a name that means, Melech in Hebrew means king, Tzedek means righteousness, so he's the king of righteousness. He's the king of Salem, king of peace, so probably referring to Jerusalem here, but still it's in reference to, I think, his character, and of course he is, most importantly, he is the priest of God Most High. So here in the author of Hebrews here kind of recounts what we saw there in Genesis 14. And of course, the significance of this is that this enables the king to fulfill a priestly role, and ultimately the Messiah to fulfill a priestly role. Because, of course, the king comes from the tribe of Judah, the priest came from the tribe of Levi. But the argument that the author of Hebrews makes here is that that Levi, as a descendant of Abraham, since Abraham ends up paying a tithe to Melchizedek, it's almost as if it's showing Levi's subordination to Melchizedek, and it's ultimately showing the superiority of the Melchizedekian, if you want to use that term, line of the priesthood. So it sets up Jesus being ultimately our great high priest, who is able, verse 25, to save forever those who draw near to him, near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for him. That's Jesus, one of the many roles that Jesus plays for us. Obviously, Jesus is so much more than that, but one of the great promises of Scripture is that Jesus is that great high priest who wins us access to God, who makes intercession to God for us, who paves the way so that we can have access to his throne of grace because of Jesus. Of course, Hebrews presents Jesus not only as the great high priest, but also, as we saw earlier in the book, as the once for all sacrifice. So he is the fulfillment of all those Old Testament offices. But Melchizedek sets the pattern for what Jesus ultimately will become, and the function and role he would ultimately play for us. And aren't we grateful for that? So that's Hebrews 7. We'll go over to Psalm 144. Psalm 144 is it's a royal psalm. It's got some interesting elements to it. It begins by using the voice of the king here. It is a psalm of David. So blessed be the Lord, my rock, who trains my hands for war, my fingers for battle. It talks about his loving kindness and God being his loving kindness and his fortress, his stronghold. But then in verse 3, it switches to kind of the king speaking for the people, talking about what is man that you take knowledge of him, the son of man that you think of him. This is actually quoting, kind of referring back to all the way back to Psalm 8, where we have a similar phrases there. Man is like a mere breath, his days are like a passing shadow, but the Lord is someone you can trust in. And then verse 5, you have almost this theophany. Remember, in theophany is where God is manifesting himself, his presence in some great physical ways. Well, here is the psalmist requesting God to do that. In contrast to the limitations of we as human beings, God has this magnificent power. And of course, at the end, we see that that God is going to, the king has confidence that God is going to bless his people with all kinds of physical blessings, because blessed are the people whose God is the Lord. So it ends with a note of confidence here. But it's interesting that here we see the king representing the people, which is how the Israelites viewed the kingship, right? That within the covenant relationship, the king was the covenant representative between God and the people. And as the king went, so went the people, which sets us up for what's going on in 2 Kings 25. The very reason that the people are going into exile is mainly because of the kings who have led them astray, not following after, for instance, things that we see here in Psalm 144. That brings us to 2 Kings 25, which is the last chapter in the book of Kings. And of course, we have here the last days of Judah as a nation. And Nebuchadnezzar besieges Jerusalem. It's a 1.5 year siege. We cannot imagine. If you want to imagine what that siege was like, go back and read Lamentations again, and you'll see what that siege would have been like. Just a devastation, a desperation, people driven to even things like cannibalism. Finally, they break through. You see that Zedekiah, this last king who had reigned from, for about 11 years, from 597 to 586 BC. By the way, Jeremiah interacted with him quite a bit as well. So if you can read in Jeremiah some of the more details about what's going on here in this one chapter. And of course, what happens to Zedekiah? Well, he has his eyes gouged out, but before he does, he has his sons killed before his eyes. And then he is bound with bronze fetters and brought to Babylon. Then, of course, Nebuchadnezzar proceeds to just wipe out the entire city. The walls, the king's house, the houses of Jerusalem, and of course, even the temple itself are burned to the ground. The great temple of Solomon burned to the ground. So you can imagine, once again, what's going on here is the complete devastation, not just of Israel, but of the faith of Israel. They are a people who are now, they've had every pillar of their faith wiped out. And this is that great crisis that everything in the book of First Kings has been driving towards. Everything has been spiraling down towards it. And of course, the reason is ultimately because of the kings leading the people astray. Well, what happens after this? Well, the poorest of the poor are left in the nation. The majority of the people are drug off to Babylon, but the poorest of the poor are left. A man named Gedaliah is made the governor of Judah at the time, installed by the Babylonians, kind of as this puppet governor. He is quickly disposed of. He is quickly killed in verse 25. And then the very last thing that we read in this text is starting in chapter 25, verse 27, is we have this note about Jehoiakim. Remember, he had been taken into exile and kept there by the Babylonians. And it talks about how he is released from prison by the king of Babylon. So it's almost kind of this sense of there's still this spark of hope. And the spark of hope is a restored kingship. Of course, that restored kingship would never happen until the person of Jesus Christ, who comes proclaiming that the kingdom of God is at hand and it was at hand in his person. So, pretty dark book, the book of First and Second Kings, but remember that it's a book written with exile-colored glasses, but it ends with a note of hope, and that hope is that ultimately God will restore his people through restoring his king, and that will be through the Messiah. So that's 2 Kings 25, and we finally have Amos chapter 1. So a couple of things about Amos. Amos is an 8th century prophet. He's probably the earliest of the writing prophets in terms of just chronology. Amos is a common guy. He was a farmer. We read in chapter 7 something of his calling. He was a raiser of sycamore figs. We also see that he is from the sheep herders of Tekoa. This probably means that he's more than just a shepherd. He's one who owned many flocks of sheep. Tekoa is a town south of Bethlehem, in the kind of the pasture grounds of Judah. When we say pasture grounds, we're not talking about rolling hills with a bunch of grass on them. We're talking about a pretty rocky, desolate environment, but goats and sheep would be able to survive out in this region. Amos he was a common guy. He wasn't a prophet or a son of the prophets. In fact, he kind of had nothing of the background of like a priest or something like that would give him the qualifications. But he is one who was called by God, and he's called by God, interestingly, to go and prophesy in the northern kingdom. So here's a guy from the southern kingdom of Judah, south of Jerusalem, going to prophesy in the northern kingdom. And we'll read about some of the things he said over in chapter 7. And it's actually a little bit of a narrative section of this text. But you can imagine, how his words would have been received if southern kingdom was always at odds with the northern kingdom. And so, here we have a guy from the south coming up from the north to make his messages or proclaim his messages. I always compare this, for instance, to at this point in time, by the way, it's been 170 years when he comes on the scene since the northern and southern kingdom had divided, which is about the same time between here and the Civil War. So if you can imagine if the Civil War had actually resulted in a dissolution of our union, and somebody from the north had come to preach in the south, or vice versa, how would that have been received? Well, that's kind of like what we see here with the book of Amos. And yet Amos has some very powerful messages for today. He mainly is focused in on a lot of the social conditions of the day. And so you'll see a lot of references to Israel's idolatry, but also Israel's, the northern kingdom's oppression of the poor and taking advantage of the widow, the orphan, those who are at the mercy of society. So that Amos is really preaching against those types of evils, those social evils, as well as the evil of idolatry that we saw, for instance, in the book of Hosea, who's prophesying around the same time. Now, does that mean he's preaching a social gospel? No, it's not. It means that he sees those social ills as indicative of, symptomatic of, a larger drifting on the part of the people of Israel. And this first chapter begins, I want to skip over verses 1 and 2 for just a moment, just make a comment on the last part of it. He begins by making some judgments against the foreign nations around Israel, but it's really to set up the judgment against Israel itself. God's going to hold these other nations to account, but he's really going to hold to account Israel, his people, and we'll see that in just a moment, or in a few days. But in chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, we kind of have a heading for the entirety of the prophecy that's going to be found in the book of Amos. And it says that this is a prophecy that came to Amos during the days of Uzziah, the king of Judah, and the days of Jeroboam, son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. So both of those kings, if you remember, had some fairly long reigns. So it's a period of relative stability politically for the northern and southern kingdom of Israel southern kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel. But it's a period of great evil, frankly. And what does he say? He says, the Lord roars from Zion, of course, Jerusalem, and from Jerusalem he utters his voice. Nice, what we would call zoomorphism there, where God is portrayed with an animal-like characteristic. And the shepherds pasture ground mourn, and the summit of Carmel dries up. What we have here is, I tell my students, this is what we would call a geographical merismus. A merismus, I've talked about in my sermon several times, is where opposites communicate totality. Well, here we have opposites communicating totality. The shepherds' pasture grounds down in Judea, where Amos is coming from. That's what he's referring to here. And of course, the summit of Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel is the most prominent geographical feature in the northern kingdom of Israel. So we got a feature from the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. So what is he saying? He's saying to this northern kingdom, who had moved, of course, under Jeroboam, had moved Jeroboam the first, not Jeroboam the second, which is referred to in this text, had moved the capital and the place of worship up to Bethel. And of course, the capital was at Samaria now, but the place of worship for the northern kingdom was at Bethel. And here is Amos saying, no, God's not at Bethel, God's here in Jerusalem. And when he utters his voice, it has effects not just here in the pasture grounds where I'm from, but it also has effects all the way up in the northern kingdom of Israel in Mount Carmel. So this is a significant religious statement that Amos is making, that God is the true God, and this God is still in his temple in Jerusalem, not in Bethel, not where you're doing all these pagan altars and pagan sacrifices. God is that true God, and when he utters his voice, it's going to have effects on you, and he is uttering his voice throughout the rest of this book of Amos. So love the book of Amos. It's going to be a fun one to look at over the next few days. So I think that's all our text for today. Amos 1, Psalm 144, Hebrews 7, and 2 Kings 25. That's a long one. So sorry about all that, but I hope you have a great rest of the day on November the 12th, 2021.